Thank you very much, Andrea, and congratulations on the new position. It's very nice to be here with you and have this opportunity to have this conversation. This is important work that you do, and I'm delighted to be part of it. I appreciate you mentioning my good friend Elijah Cummings, who I woke up in the middle of the night, like I sometimes do, and I pulled out my device, and I was just shocked to see that news, because he was a great man and a great leader in our country. So it's a real loss for the whole nation, not just for those of us in Maryland who knew him so well. But it made me think that the question in the next election is really a leadership question, because when you lose a great leader, you start thinking about this concept of leadership. And I think it's one of the most important questions, if not the most important questions, the American people have to ask themselves when they're choosing our next president, which is, what kind of leader are we looking for? And to me, the most important characteristic of leadership that this nation needs so desperately at this moment in time is for our next president to be a truth teller. Because I feel like the American people have not been hearing the truth from our elected officials for some time. And I believe the American people not only deserve the truth, but they can handle the truth. And we will not be able to pursue the many opportunities available to this country or overcome the significant challenges we face here and the world is facing unless we actually talk honestly about what's happening in the world. An honest dialogue about the good and the bad, the facts and the reality is required before we can actually make the kind of progress that I know we can make. This is a magnificent country. We have every advantage any nation could possibly want to have, except for one thing. We have a broken government in Washington. And to fix that, we need to get back to the truth. One of the important truths we need to talk about are the economic truths. The only way we're going to grow the economy to benefit all Americans is to create the kind of dynamic where the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector are working well together. That is the only way to achieve our maximum economic potential. If you travel around this country, which I've had the privilege of doing, or if you travel around the world, which I had the privilege of doing in my prior career in the private sector, you see that whenever you see a good economy, you see strong collaboration between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. They're working together towards shared economic outcomes and prosperity. You cannot have government-only solutions, just like you can have private sector-only solutions. So getting back to that fundamental truth about collaboration is critical. The other truth that has to be told is that we live in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, and that it has never been more important to citizens in the United States of America what happens around the world than it is today. And we need a president who wants to embrace this notion of global engagement for the common good of not only our citizens, but for the world. I happen to be one of those people who believes that the post-World War II model of U.S. foreign policy, which was rooted in engagement and alliances, and the United States working through its allies to try to make the world more prosperous and more secure and more peaceful, was fundamentally correct. It wasn't perfect. We made some really big mistakes. But in truth, and this is something that's not said, the world gets better every single day, despite all the challenges we face. You know, in the last several decades, literally billions of human beings have been lifted out of poverty. The global poverty rate goes down every single year. Why? Because we've become an interconnected world. And that's fundamentally positive. And nationalism or isolationism, whether it be a Republican form or a Democratic form, is the wrong answer to any question we face, no matter what issue. Climate change, for example. We all watched in horror several weeks ago as the Amazon burned. Well, why did that happen? Well, it's pretty simple. And you know actually something about this here in Iowa. The largest buyer of soybeans, China, stopped buying soybeans from the largest seller of soybeans, the United States of America. Why? Because we're in a trade war. What did farmers in Brazil do? Well, they viewed this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to sell soybeans to China. So they wanted to plant soybeans. The problem is there were a lot of trees in the way, and so they burned them. My point is, every issue is based on this notion of interconnected world, and we have to embrace it. That's the truth. The truth is a lot of Americans are struggling. 40% of our citizens cannot afford their basic necessities. Half the American people can't afford a $500 surprise expense. 80% of the professionally managed venture capital in the United States of America last year was invested in 50 counties out of over 3,000 in this country. So 1.6% of the counties got all the smart money. And yet 80% of our kids live in a county where the jobs that are getting created are not as good as the jobs that used to exist. That's the truth. What those people don't need any more of is partisanship, gridlock, or ideology. That's the last thing they need. Right? People who are secure and prosperous, they have time in the world to engage in these ridiculous ideological arguments. Capitalism versus socialism and all this stuff. What most Americans need are solutions. They need us to build infrastructure, which we used to spend 5% of our economy doing. Now we're down to 2.5%. China spends 8%. Who's got the right strategy there? They need us to do things like doubling the earned income tax credit, which is the most effective way to put money in the pockets of hardworking Americans. They need these kind of real solutions that can get done and are responsive to the needs of the American people. That's the truth. The truth is we should have a form of universal health care in this country. Every American should have health care as a basic human right. We can afford it, we're spending enough money to do it, and it's also smart economic policy. I mean, I started my first business when my wife and I were expecting our first child. Neither of us had any money. I was the first in my family to go to college. I had a job and I had health care through my job. The only reason I was able to start my company, which created thousands of jobs, by the way, was because my wife, April, was working, and her company gave us health care. But for that, I wouldn't have left my job, because I'm a responsible person. Those stories exist everywhere. People are shackled to their job because of health care. We need a universal health care system. But it shouldn't be a system that makes private insurance illegal. That's a terrible idea. Almost no country in the world has that. All the countries that have universal health care, which people like to talk about, very few of them have a single-payer system where the government's the only payer. Why? Because people want choices. Also, governments rarely reimburse the cost of health care. And private insurance actually provides a cross-subsidy that allows the whole healthcare system to work. That's the truth. The truth is climate change is an existential risk, but it can't be solved on the backs of workers because it'll never get solved that way. And the truth is it is a global issue. Billions of human beings will be lifted out of poverty again in the next several decades. That's an amazing thing. We should all be celebrating that. But you know what happens when someone goes from a condition of abject poverty to something other than poverty? They need energy. And you can't expect the developing countries of the world to deny their citizens energy because of climate change. They will not do it. So we, the developed world, the wealthy nations in the world, the United States and others, fundamentally have to innovate and come up with battery and storage and direct air capture technologies and deliver these solutions to the world if we ever want to solve this problem. That's the truth. And the truth is our current president is a symptom of a deeper disease. And obviously as a Democratic nominee for president, or someone who's running for the Democratic nomination for president, I think the most important job is to defeat and cure that symptom in 2020. But the disease is deeper. And that's the truth. And the disease is divisiveness. This notion that we're not in this together, that for some reason so many Americans wake up every day and think their enemy is their fellow American because of differences. That's just wrong. We got to get back to the roots that this amazing country grew from in the sunlight of a cause worth fighting for, that we're in fact all in this together. And this notion of common purpose is central to who we are as a people. And that our next leader has to be someone who wakes up every day and has a quiet moment, maybe in prayer or just among themselves, and they ask for strength to try to do something every single day to unify this nation. Because united we do stand, and divided we do fall. And right now we're terribly divided. It puts us in a bad position to potentially have to deal with a huge challenge, but importantly, it prevents us from doing anything. And what's happened to our country is the world has changed so fast. And so much of this change has been extraordinarily positive, but it hasn't been positive for everyone. And huge amounts of our country have been left behind. And it's been terrible for them, it's terrible for their kids, and it's destabilizing our political system. And in turn, destabilizing the world. And we have to solve these problems together, and we can. But we have to do them together. And that, to me, is the defining characteristic of the next president. That leader who wants to tell the truth, who is committed to unifying this country, and is committed to finding common ground on the big issues we face and getting things done to build that better future. We can do it, but we have to do it all together. And that is why I'm running for president. So I'm grateful that you gave me this opportunity, and I think we're going to have a couple questions. Is that right? Great. Thank you.
All right, this is on. So thank you, Congressman, for your remarks and for joining us today. Want to start with a few questions from our sponsors, and the first being our presenting sponsor, Bank of America. They ask their clients, teammates, and community the same question that guide them in their work. And that question is, what would you like the power to do? So with that, they'd like to ask you the same question. What would you like the power to do? Grab the one out of your pocket there. Sorry about that. Does that work?
Is that better?
Yes.
Well, the power, at the end of the day, I've been the CEO of 2 public companies. And people think you have a lot of power as CEO. Really, that power comes from leadership of a team that is pursuing a common mission. And so what I would like the power to do is to unify this country. It doesn't mean we agree with each other on everything. We don't want to live in that country. But what it does mean is that there is a sense of common purpose and common destiny. There's a sense of shared sacrifice. There's a sense of responsibility towards our fellow Americans and our nation and our world. And that we work together towards common goals. That's the power I'd like to have, which is to have a role in leading that movement, because that's what I think this country needs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next question comes from the National Skills Coalition Voices for Skills initiative. A majority of jobs in Iowa and the U.S. overall require skills training. These jobs are the backbone of our economy, and 86% of Iowa voters want the U.S. to invest in skills training for these jobs at the same level that we invest in college degrees. But currently, that's not necessarily happening. We hear a lot about candidates' proposals to make college affordability an economic priority. Will you make skills training an equal priority, and if so, how?
Yes. One of the problems we have with college in this country is a lot of people are going to college, a lot of them are borrowing a lot of money, and a lot of them are graduating with degrees that don't get them the kind of jobs that they need to support themselves and pay off the investment they've made. Which doesn't mean college isn't a good investment, it is. But in general, the system is broken. And so there's got to be much more of an orientation on the skills you obtain, and then the skills you continue to get across your life. Because, my dad was an electrician. He had in a union. He had one job for 60 years. That's going to be very unusual in the future. To People are going to have lots of jobs, and they're going to need to continue to get trained and access the training. So what I favor, in addition to creating not free 4-year college, which some people are calling for, which I don't think actually makes sense. I don't think we have the money for it. I think it creates an incentive for everyone to get a 4-year degree, which is not the right incentive. I'd rather allocate some of that capital more towards pre-K and early childhood. But what I do want to do is create a system where people can get career and technical training or community college for free as part of public education. Part of that will come through my national service program, where if you serve the country in military infrastructure, community service, or a new climate corps, you get either 2 or 3 years in-state tuition for free. But part of it is also informed by my view that the way these programs are successful, really the only way they're successful, is what I said at the beginning. You need collaboration. So skills training programs work when the local employers are involved in the development of the curriculum and make commitments to really hire people who get the skills. And then it justifies governments, nonprofits, whatever the case may be, in actually building these. I had a successful example in my district where we had a community college, and this is in Maryland, where there's a lot of cyber jobs. We had a community college that created a certificate program for cyber. And they did it in partnership with Johns Hopkins, which is obviously a great institution. Johns Hopkins developed the curriculum. The community college administered the program. The businesses in the area supported the program. And 98% of the graduates got jobs. And they had a certificate in cyber. And the certificate was from the community college, Hagerstown Community College, and Johns Hopkins. And so if you're an employer looking to hire cyber people when you have a huge shortage, you see these kids coming out of this community college with a joint community college Hopkins certificate in cyber. I mean, I'm not saying they're hiring them sight unseen, but they're like, we got a pipeline. And we can do this. I mean, I was up in Jefferson visiting with a place called The Forge, which just opened backed by Accenture, which is going to have 30 people working doing data work remotely on contracts that Accenture has all over the world. And they have an academy there, they have an apprenticeship there, but what they've really done is develop collaboration with the high schools and the colleges to create a pipeline for kids to get basic certificate training and then come into their apprenticeship program. That's the stuff we got to do.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have one more sponsor question, and this comes to us from the Iowa Biotechnology Association. The pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. currently develops 57% of the world's new medicines. This takes major investment and risk to bring new and, in some cases, life-saving drugs to patients. Discussion at the federal level about drug pricing and proposals to make major changes to implement significant new price controls, including the International Pricing Index, and what Iowa biopharmaceutical members see as a detrimental challenge to Medicaid, appear to be aimed at government savings, without focusing on the effects on patients and the industry as a whole. So Iowa Bio is concerned these changes could impede patient access to the most cutting-edge drugs and stifle investment in pharmaceutical research and development without lowering patients' out-of-pocket costs. How do you plan to address drug pricing?
Mm-hmm. So their concerns are important because innovation is crucial to improving quality of life, particularly in life sciences. And we've seen extraordinary progress. And I think with big data and computing power the way it is today, we're at the threshold of amazing breakthroughs. We could cure cancer and Alzheimer's in the next several decades, which in many ways we have to, because it's destroying our country and destroying our fiscal condition. But you can't overstate this. So some people running for president believe pharmaceutical companies shouldn't make any money. That's obviously a really dumb idea, because then there'll be no incentive for them to invest and take risk and come up with innovation, because they have to have a return on that investment. And that's the point they're making. The problem is, and we have to just be honest about this, the U.S. citizen funds the entire global pharmaceutical industry. Meaning, putting aside the poor countries who should buy drugs cheap because otherwise they can't get them. The wealthy nations in Europe, Germany, Spain, places like this, they pay a third to a quarter of what we do for drugs. Same drugs. And so if you look at the profits in the pharmaceutical industry, it is entirely coming from the U.S. citizens. So we have to ask ourselves a question, which is, That's an important consideration. But is it fair that the US citizen effectively allows the rest of the world to free ride on us? That's a legitimate question we have to ask ourselves. And I think what the American people would say is, we want the innovation. If you want the innovation, the companies need to make a profit, obviously. But I think most Americans would say, but we'd like that burden to be shared by the other wealthy nations in the world. That seems fair. And so what that means is the US government has to work with other countries in developing some kind of global scheme for pricing, which doesn't have a goal of gutting the profits of the pharmaceutical companies necessarily. My point is very simple. I want them to make the same amount of money. I just want them to make it in different places. So if they're charging $30 for a drug in Germany, which is a very wealthy country, by the way, and they're charging $100 for the same drug here, what I would like them to do is to charge $65 in each country. They'll make the same amount of money, but the US citizens get more of a fair deal. And that's where I am on this issue. I'm so pro-innovation. I'm so pro-investing in basic research. I'm so pro in creating the environment where biotech startups and entrepreneurs can build businesses and create jobs and create societal wealth. And to do that, they need incentives, profit incentives, absolutely. Pro all that. I just want this to be a little more fair to the American taxpayer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So those will wrap up our sponsor questions, and now we'd like to open it up to questions from you all. We've got a couple of mics. Kara and Marissa can bring them to you, or you're welcome to go towards them, but we'd love to hear a couple of questions from the audience. Who's first? We've got one right in the middle here.
Thank you for coming today.
Sure.
What is your proposal or path forward on addressing wealth inequality within the U.S., which is the gap is continuing to grow?
Absolutely. So I think there's several things we got to do. The first thing is we got to invest in communities and people so that they actually have opportunities and skills in their communities and in themselves. One of the reasons that wealth gap is so huge is because so many communities, and therefore the citizens in those communities, are struggling. They've been underinvested in. So we need to build infrastructure, huge infrastructure program. We need to invest in things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, right, which will lift wages. I've called for a doubling of the Earned Income Tax Credit. Best anti-poverty program we have in this country. It puts money in the pockets of hard-working American workers who are at the lower end of the income scale. I want to double it, which means 14 million more people will get it, and they'll get $1,500 more a year. That's the simplest thing we can do to actually lift up people who are struggling. I want to raise the minimum wage, obviously. I want to do things like we talked about skills training. I want to do all those things, which are all about lifting people up, creating jobs in communities that are left behind, creating economic opportunity for people. I want a universal health care system where everyone gets health care as a basic right. I call for a $125 billion increase in federal affordable housing. So I want to get at the basic needs that the American people have. 40% of them can't afford their housing, they can't afford their food or their utilities. I want to put more money in their pocket by increasing their pay, by increasing their tax benefits through this EITC, by creating better paying jobs in their communities, by rebuilding this whole country with infrastructure, creating incentives for people to invest in their communities and driving entrepreneurship. I want to do all those things. And the way I'm going to pay for that, because all that costs money, and I don't want to leave the next generation a crippling financial burden, the way I'm going to pay for that is by increasing taxes on wealthy Americans. And so what that will do over time is narrow income inequality, because I will fundamentally do things to lift the bottom half of our country up economically, which should be our goal. When people talk to me about the economy, I'm like, listen, all the metrics you talk about the economy actually don't matter all that much, because there's not really an average American anymore. All these metrics are about your average American. The problem is there's an average of the top half and the average of the bottom half, and those things have been diverging dramatically. So don't tell me about what the average, it doesn't actually tell me anything. Tell me the average of the bottom half. If that number's not going up, we got a problem. Right now it's not going up. We got a problem. We need to do things, and I just went through them all, that will make them go up. To pay for those things without crippling us financially, we're going to have higher taxes on wealthy Americans. What that's going to do, because right now, one of the biggest loopholes in our tax code is that if you invest money for a living, you pay a lower tax rate than people who work for a living. That's ridiculous. It is all justified based on this myth that wealthy people won't invest unless their tax rate is lower. That's just not true. No wealthy American is going to sit on their cash because their capital gains rate is the same as the ordinary income rate. So I propose to actually do what Ronald Reagan was the last president to do, when he said very eloquently, I don't see why people who invest for a living, God bless them, should pay less in taxes than people who work for a living. And Reagan was right. Every president since Reagan has allowed this to diverge. So I want to close that gap, take those revenues, fund the programs I talk about. What that means is the bottom half will get lifted up, and the top half, which are very blessed and doing really well, they'll still be very blessed and doing well, but their wealth won't compound at a lower tax rate than everyone else's. So what you'll inevitably see is a rising of the bottom, and you'll still see a rising of the top, but it just won't rise as fast, and that will get us back to more equilibrium, in my opinion. Sure.
Next question. Mary?
With your work around artificial intelligence, and you talked about lifelong learning, we know here in our region the number of industries and jobs that will be impacted by AI, machine learning, robotics, and so forth. Tell us a little bit about what is your vision for this educational ecosystem that is going to need to respond for everyone, and particularly the adult working population that will need reskilling and retooling for this world that is here and continuing to come at us?
It's a great question, Mary. And it's so important that we talk about this because there's a lot of misplaced fear about this topic. So the first fear that people have that's misplaced is that for some reason all this innovation is going to get rid of all the jobs. That's never going to happen. That has never happened historically, but it's always led to fear because people see the jobs that are getting taken away because they're visible, but they never see the jobs that the innovation creates. So like that was the Luddite movement back in the Industrial Revolution when people were trying to destroy machines. And even to this day, with all this innovation we have, today there are more jobs being created. The problem is they don't pay enough. We have a pay problem more than a job problem, which is why we got to get some of the things from the prior question. So that's the first thing. So we got to be clear-eyed with the American people. There's going to be plenty of jobs. It's just hard to see them. Like people, look what happened with travel. We used to have travel agents all over this country. In little small towns, big towns, you'd see a travel agent. If you wanted to book travel, you'd go into the travel agent, you'd sit down with someone, they'd pull out books. You'd pick where you're going to travel. They'd pull out pieces of paper. You'd fill out forms. And that's how you book travel. Very expensive, very cumbersome. Small percentage of the population travel. The internet, Expedia, Priceline, all these things, and everything else completely disrupted that industry, and we lost all those jobs. I mean, we still have some travel agents, but in general, we lost all those jobs. But the travel and leisure industry has grown much faster than inflation. And many more jobs that have been created. Why? Because the cost of travel went down a lot. And so more Americans could travel. And so we've built a huge hospitality, lodging, transportation business. And many more jobs have been created than were lost. And that's how this plays out. You couldn't see all those jobs when you saw the travel agencies closing. You're like, oh my God, we're going to lose all these jobs. So that's why you got to be careful of false prophets selling fear on this. But what you got to do is you got to make sure you prepare people for the transition. And to your point, you got to make sure they have the skills. Got to make sure we have the skills. And we have to think about skills training as lifelong learning. I think one of my 4 daughters might have 15 jobs. That's why they ought to have a universal healthcare system. So when they leave their job, they don't have to worry about their healthcare, which will make them maybe get skills and try to get a better job, encourage economic mobility. We've got to create centers of continuing education that are rooted in partnerships with the private sector and the nonprofit sector, so they're geared to give people the skills they need. We've got to reimagine our public education system. The kids are graduating with better skills. We got to reform it to make it pre-K through 14 as opposed to K through 12. And we got to encourage a lot of distance learning. I mean, I would love, my youngest daughter is 12, she's in 7th grade. I would love for math, for example, for her to spend half the week getting instructed by the best math teacher in the country, even if she shares that math teacher with 100,000 kids using technology. Then I'd want the other half of the week for her to break down in incredibly small groups or one-on-one with her teacher. Right? That's, to me, how I would think about education. Right? Really concentrated, personalized, like person-to-person learning when you need it, and then using technology. We don't see that in our public education system the way we need to, but that's how we got to think about it. So thank you, Mary.
Do we have another question from the audience? Yes, right here.
So, John, I've read your book. I've listened to you speak a couple of times.
I know.
And I'm curious.
You're in the financial planning business.
Yes, I am. Yeah. So, my question is, what's your path forward? I mean, you're mired in the bottom tier in the polls.
Yep.
You're not participating in the debates, and I think you're a great candidate, and with great ideas. And what's it going to take to get people's attention?
It takes Iowa at the end of the day. I mean, the DNC has worked really hard to make sure the early states are less relevant this time. They've tried to nationalize the election every way they could to take away a lot of the power Iowa and New Hampshire have. Because a lot of people in the Democratic Party don't like the fact that Iowa and New Hampshire go first. Why do you guys have the right to do this? All that stuff. You hear it all the time. There's a concerted effort to basically gut the early state process going on in this country, spearheaded in many ways by the Democratic National Committee. They can do that if they want. If that's what the majority of their people want to do, they can do it. But that's what's happening. So to me, that's a mistake, because I think what Iowa and New Hampshire have uniquely is the opportunity to meet people and figure people out in a way you can't figure them out by listening to them 75 seconds on the debate stage or any of this other stuff. And it's incredibly important. And your job is not to pick the president, because I don't think that's how you actually view your job, because this is a democracy and every state's got to participate. But I think what your job is to find people that other people don't know as well and cause some surprises and say to the American people, you ought to think about this. And so what I'm banking on is doing well in the Iowa caucus. Well for me is better than expectations. Well for me doesn't necessarily mean winning the Iowa caucus, although I'd like to win the Iowa caucus. But it means coming in much better than expectations. Think of it like a stock. There's performance and there's expectations. If you're expected to do really well and you come in a little short, people really think you failed. And if the expectations are low and you exceed, it creates a lot of momentum. And that's how I'm thinking about it. So what I need Iowa to do is to step forward if they think my ideas are good. I'm the only person who's been to all 99 counties. I got this new thing I'm rolling out called the Heartland Startup Tour, where I'm going around to rural Iowa and talking about entrepreneurship and innovation and how to create jobs in these small towns that you've all seen shrink and age and been hollowed out. And if people think that's relevant, they need to step forward and say, yeah, you need to pay attention to this person. And that's what I need Iowa to do for me.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Well, I will ask
Thank you.
one.
Oh, sure.
Let me ask one more. Congressman, you've spent quite a bit of time in Iowa.
I have.
All around the state, all 99 counties. What are the top 2 or 3 highlights, places, experiences you've had here in the state?
So I'm not going to pick one favorite place of Iowa over the other, because I need all of Iowa to like me. Although I have had some very good meals and some very special times in your state. So, you know, one of the things that happened recently, I was in southwest Iowa, and I was touring damage from the floods. And I was 2.5 miles from the river. And the devastation in these towns were just terrible. And you realize how impacted Iowa is by our failure to invest in infrastructure and the things that are going on in climate change. And, you know, that was a recent, really kind of impactful thing. I was up in Storm Lake, Iowa, not long ago doing a little roundtable with the most fabulous journalist that I've met since I've run for president in many ways. I mean, there's been a couple, but Art Cullen, who I think is a bit of a hero. And I encourage anyone to read his book because it's the best description of really what's happened to rural America in many ways, many of the books I've read. But he writes for the Storm Lake Times, which he and his brother own. And we had a roundtable about immigration. And what's interesting is there's, you know, even though some of these small towns have changed, there's been such a resurgence of energy in these towns because of this wave of immigrants who have just grabbed onto that bottom ladder of the American dream, and they're just starting to climb. And it's really invigorated a lot of these small towns. And it's a story that I don't think is told around the country as much. And I think Storm Lake is a good example, where it has a whole new vibe and whole new energy because of the immigrant community that's moved into its town. Tonight I'm going to be having dinner at one of my favorite restaurants up in Waterloo, which has a painting of a replica of the Sistine Chapel. You know what I'm talking about? I've been there, yeah. On its ceiling that the owner's son spray painted. It's extraordinary. Like you walk into this restaurant and literally there's a replica of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You know what I'm talking about? Yep. On the ceiling of this restaurant. And it's remarkably good, and it was done by the owner's son when he was 16 using spray cans. You know, and you're like, I wasn't expecting to see that in Waterloo, Iowa.
There were thousands of spray cans used, I believe.
But it's extraordinary, isn't it? So that's where we are tonight, right, Brent? Galleria in Paco. Isn't it? So, I mean, I could go on. You know, there's things you've seen that upset you, like the flooding. There's things that you've seen that have energized, like how some of the immigrant communities are energizing some of these small towns. And then there's things you see that you would have never thought, like the ceiling of the restaurant. So those are some of them.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
We do, as Iowans, like to hear about ourselves. And
yes.